No hymn played when she stepped out of the wagon. No warm welcome waited at the edge of dustwater. Just cracked dirt, cold stares, and a silence sharp enough to draw blood. Hester Washington had crossed 3 states with a nothing but a scar on her jaw, a bent letter in her pocket, and the kind of resolve most men mistook for madness. They thought she'd come looking for a husband. Truth was, she came looking for a place to finally stop running. What she found was a town that laughed in her face, and a man who didn't. Silas McBride didn't see a broken woman's. He saw a flame still burning, and in the ashes of shame and judgment, they struck a match no one saw coming. Redemption never shows up wearing white. Sometimes it's wrapped in patched skirts and mule sweat, limping into town under a dying sun. And sometimes, the strongest frontier is the one built between 2 ruined hearts willing to try again. What did you think of today's story? If it brought you any warmth or made you smile even for a second, drop a simple "good" in the comments below. Got your own thoughts or feelings? I'd love to hear them seriously. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it truly helps us grow this space for stories that matter. Thanks so much for being here. The dust of the Colorado Territory clung to Hester Washington like a shroud, a gritty testament to a journey that had leached the hope from her bones, but not the steel from her spine. She was a woman etched by time and hardship, somewhere between 40 and 50 years, her face a roadmap of sorrows endured and battles fought, a subtle limp, a ghost of past brutalities. Be it the lash of a slaver's whip or the crushing toil of a life unchosen, marked her passage as she descended from the battered stagecoach into the raw, burgeoning chaos of Redemption Creek. The town was a fresh wound in the earth, spewing forth minors and promises with equal, reckless abandon. In her worn satchel, 2 letters lay like opposing fates. One, a thin reed of possibility from a contact at the Redemption Creek Church, hinted at a fragile welcome, a whisper of acceptance in a land that rarely offered such to her kind. The other, heavier, bore the scent of calculation. It was from a Josiah Flint, a name that tasted like old money and sour intentions, procured through a mail-order bride agency of ill repute. Hester knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her marrow, that Flint's request for a colored woman, hard-working, not given to complaints, was no tender search for companionship. He'd likely seen her old photograph, a relic from a time before the world had stolen so much, and envisioned a beast of burden, not a bride. Yet, desperation was a cruel master, and Redemption Creek, for all its rawness, was the last stop on a line of dwindling chances. The church, when she found it, stood stark and unforgiving against the vast, indifferent sky, its newly sawn timber smelling faintly of resin and righteousness. Inside, the air was thick with a piety that felt exclusive. A closed circle, Reverend Gideon Blackwood, a man whose face seemed carved from granite and judgment, regarded her from the pulpit. His eyes, cold as a mountain stream in deep winter, swept over her, lingering on her dark skin, her travel-worn clothes, the slight unevenness of her gait. A hush fell, not of reverence, but of appraisal, sharp and unwelcoming. The Reverend began, his voice a dry rasp that carried to every corner of the small building. We weren't expecting someone like you. The pause was a chasm filled with the unspoken. Mr. Josiah Flint must have made some error in his correspondence, and regardless, his gaze hardened, flicking over her as if she were a stray cur that had wandered in. This church, Madame, is not a sanctuary for your kind. The words, each a poisoned dart, struck home. A ripple of snickers, quickly suppressed, but no less cruel, ran through the predominantly white congregation. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across a barren yard. Followed, "Imagine the nerve. Flint wouldn't—" What was she thinking? Hester Washington stood tall. The weariness was a cloak, yes, but beneath it, her spirit, though bruised, remained unbroken. She didn't flinch, didn't beg. The years had taught her the futility of pleading with hearts already turned to stone. She simply met the Reverend's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her own deep-set eyes. Defiance, perhaps, or a sorrow too profound for tears. Then, with a dignity that shamed their scorn, she turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a soft, definitive click. The sun beat down, merciless. Redemption Creek offered no shade, no solace. She found herself by a gnarled, ancient cottonwood on the town's ragged edge, its branches spreading wide as if in a weary benediction. There, Hester sank to the parched earth, the two letters still clutched in her hand. Penniless, foodless, waterless, the vastness of the West, once a symbol of potential escape, now felt like an open grave. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, settled beside her, its weight pressing down, threatening to extinguish the last embers of her resolve. It was then that a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a man, younger than her, raw-boned and sun-weathered, his work clothes dusted with the same ochre earth that clung to her. His left hand was crudely bandaged. He wasn't one of the mockers from the church. She'd have remembered his face. He held out a dented tin canteen. "Saw what they did in there," he said, his voice low, a little rough around the edges. "Ain't no call for that. No one deserves to be spat on by the righteous." He gestured with the canteen. "Water. You look like you could use it." Hester studied him. There was no pity in his eyes, just a straightforward acknowledgement of an injustice witnessed. She accepted the canteen. Her throat so dry, the first swallow was painful. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. He nodded, hunkering down a respectful distance away. "Silas McBride," he offered. "Got a little homestead south of here. Ain't much more than a whisper of a dream and a leaky roof right now." A wry, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "Was supposed to be two of us. My intended, Rosie Dean. She lit out last week. Took my best pair of boots and a chunk of my pride with him." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Still got the marriage license, though. Paid good money for it. Seems a waste." Hester merely listened, the water a small comfort against the desolation in her soul. The man's troubles were his own, yet his simple act of decency was a balm. Silas watched her, a strange, sudden resolve hardening his gaze. He'd seen the cruelty in that church, the casual, sanctimonious venom. He'd seen this woman absorb it without shattering. He wasn't a man given to grand gestures, but something about her quiet strength, her visible suffering, and the raw deal life had just handed her, struck a chord deep within his own scarred places. "Mrs. Washington," he began, his voice gaining a surprising firmness. "I ain't got much to offer. This land, it's a hard mistress. Got a couple of goats, a shack that barely keeps the wind out, and hands calloused from trying to scratch a livin' from it. But I got a marriage license, a roof, such as it is, and a man's respect, which I reckon is worth something." He met her astonished gaze directly. "I'm asking, ma'am, will you marry me? Today, right here. No church, no fancy words from preachers who talk of God but practice hate. Just you, me, this paper, and whatever God's listenin' from up yonder, if he is at all." Hester stared, speechless. The dust, the heat, the gnawing hunger, all seemed to recede. Was this man touched in the head? Or was this the West, in its brutal, unpredictable entirety, offering one last, desperate gamble? You serious?" "Boy, she finally rasped, suspicion warring with a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. A perilous, fragile hope. You don't know the first thing about me. And, well, you got eyes. I'm a colored woman. Silas McBride's gaze didn't waver. It held a sincerity that was as stark and undeniable as the mountains on the horizon. I see a woman who didn't weep, didn't grovel when a whole town turned its back on her. I saw you walk out of that hornet's nest with your head held high enough to scrape the sky. Your skin don't tell me who you are, Mrs. Washington, but that spine of yours, that grit, that speaks volumes. And for me, ma'am, he said, a quiet conviction ringing in his words, that's more than enough. It's a damn sight more than I've seen in folks who claim to be better. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the cottonwood leaves and the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Hester looked at this young, calloused man. He was offering her not a grand romance, but a partnership of necessity, a shared struggle against a harsh world. It was a lifeline, thrown by an unlikely hand. In the deepest water, she had nothing left to lose, and perhaps, in the stark honesty of his proposal, something vital to gain. Survival. A sliver of dignity. Slowly, a decision formed, as hard and unyielding as the land itself. All right, Mr. McBride, she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its lost strength. I reckon I do. And so, under the vast, unblinking eye of the Colorado sky, with the ancient cottonwood as their cathedral, and the wind as their witness, Hester Washington and Silas McBride bound their fates. No organ music played, just the whispering leaves. No congregation stood in judgment or approval, only perhaps a curious hawk circling high above, a silent observer to a most unconventional, and perhaps most honest, of unions. He smoothed out the license on a flat rock, and with a stub of pencil, they signed their names, two solitary figures forging an alliance against the indifference of the world. The signatures, stark against the official paper, were a brittle claim in a land that respected little beyond strength and endurance. The wind, their sole witness, seemed to carry their whispered vows away into the vast, uncaring expanse, with the sun beginning its slow dip towards the jagged horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Silas McBride retrieved the license. Well, Mrs. McBride, he said, the newness of the title strange on his tongue, yet not entirely unwelcome. Home ain't much, but it's south of here. Best we get movin' before dark fully settles. Hester nodded, the single word a heavier burden than any she'd carried on the long road to Redemption Creek. Home. The concept felt alien, a phantom limb. She rose, her slight limp more pronounced after the day's emotional battery, and followed Silas as he struck out from the town's edge. The journey to Silas's claim was a silent testament to his earlier words. It wasn't far, perhaps a mile or two, but it felt like a descent into a more primal existence. The last vestiges of Redemption Creek, the distant yelps of saloon revelry, the faint glow of lantern light, faded behind them, replaced by the chirr of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures in the sagebrush. The land grew stonier, the vegetation more sparse. This was a place that demanded, not offered. His homestead came into view as the last light bled from the sky. A canvas lean-to, stretched taut over a crude frame of scavenged poles, looking more like a temporary hunter's blind than a dwelling. Beside it, a blackened fire pit, a stack of firewood that seemed woefully inadequate against the coming night, and a few battered tin pots. A pair of goats bleated softly from a small, makeshift pen. This was it, the sum total of Silas McBride's worldly possessions, and now, by a bizarre twist of fate, hers too. The night dropped like a stone, bringing with it the high desert chill that bit through their thin clothes. Silas coaxed a reluctant fire from the embers, the flames casting dancing, distorted shadows on the canvas walls. They ate in silence. A handful of dried jerky Silas produced from a saddlebag, and water from his canteen. Awkwardness hung heavy between them, a palpable thing. They were husband and wife, bound by a piece of paper and a shared defiance. Yet they were strangers, each carrying a cargo of unspoken histories. When the fire dwindled to glowing coals, Silas laid out the single, worn blanket he owned on the hard-packed earth inside the lean-to. "It ain't much," he said, his voice low, "but it's all there is." He gestured for her to take it, intending to sleep by the fire. Hester looked at the blanket, then at him. The chill was already seeping into her bones. "We share it," she stated, not a request, but a simple declaration of practicality. No sense in both of us freezing. A flicker of surprise, then understanding, crossed his face. He nodded, and they lay down, a careful distance between them. The thin blanket, a meager shield against the cold and the unspoken complexities of their new reality. Sleep was a skittish creature that night, but as the hours passed, the shared, desperate warmth, the quiet rhythm of another's breathing, began to erode the sharp edges of their solitude. An unspoken respect, born of mutual hardship, began to weave its first fragile threads. The days that followed were a blur of relentless toil. The sun rose, demanding, and they met its challenge. Silas, with a stubborn determination that mirrored the unyielding land, worked to clear more ground, his axe ringing against stubborn roots, his muscles straining as he wrestled rocks from the earth. He'd disappear for hours, hunting, sometimes returning with a rabbit or a grouse, often with nothing but a deeper etching of fatigue around his eyes. Hester, drawing on a lifetime of making something from nothing, proved her worth tenfold. The patch of earth Silas had deemed too poor for anything but weeds, she coaxed into life. With an almost reverent patience, she planted the few hardy seeds she'd carried with her. Squash, beans, resilient greens that could withstand the arid soil and punishing sun. She mended Silas's torn clothes with neat, economical stitches. Her hands, though rough, surprisingly deft. She tended the goats, her quiet presence seeming to soothe their skittishness. One afternoon, Silas returned, dragging a small buck he'd managed to bring down. He was exhausted, ready to just gut it and hang it. To his astonishment, Hester took his knife, and with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a past he couldn't imagine, she dressed the deer, her movements precise, economical, wasting nothing. The sight of this woman, who had faced down a preacher and a town's scorn, now calmly and expertly butchering game, filled him with a profound, if unsettling, admiration. Their life was stripped bare, elemental. Hunger was a constant companion, fatigue a nightly visitor. Yet, in the shared struggle, a rhythm emerged. Words were few, but actions spoke volumes. A cup of water offered without asking, a heavier stone lifted together, a silent acknowledgement of a task well done. Then, one blistering afternoon, a figure on horseback appeared, a dark blot against the shimmering heat haze. As it drew closer, Hester recognized the stiff, righteous posture, Reverend Gideon Blackwood. Silas, who was attempting to reinforce a section of the goat pen, straightened, his hand instinctively going to the handle of the axe propped beside him. Hester felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Blackwood reined in his horse a short distance from the lean-to, his face a mask of grim disapproval. He didn't dismount. His gaze swept over their meager camp, lingering on Hester with undisguised contempt. Perhaps, as Hester suspected, some of his good congregants, scandalized by the McBride Washington Union, had prodded him, Or perhaps he saw it as his divine duty to stamp out such an affront to his narrow definition of moral order. "McBride, woman," he boomed, his voice carrying an unholy authority. "I have come to speak on the matter of this arrangement." Silas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Hester. "This is my property, Reverend, and this is my wife." Blackwood scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "Wife, this union is an abomination, a defiance of our community's sacred values, an affront to God himself. And you," he spat, his eyes locking onto Hester, "woman of color, have no right to respect here. You defile what is decent." Hester felt the old, familiar rage begin to simmer, a slow burn beneath the surface of her hard-won composure. But before Silas could unleash the fury gathering in his own eyes, she stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the Reverend's venom. "Reverend," she said, her chin high, "my skin defines neither my piety nor my dignity. It is men like you who invoke God to sow division and hatred, who truly defile faith." The preacher's face purpled. Insolence. "You dare!" "She dares speak the truth, which is more than I can say for you," Silas interjected, his voice like flint striking steel. He took another step, closing the distance, his body a shield before Hester. "She is my wife, Reverend, and this is our home. The only respect and order I care about is that between one human being and another, not your narrow prejudices, not your twisted readings of Scripture. You will leave now, and you will not return." For a moment, Blackwood seemed about to explode, to call down fire and brimstone, but something in Silas's eyes, a dangerous, unwavering resolve, gave him pause. He saw not a repentant sinner, but a man pushed to his limit, a man who would defend his ground, and his woman, with whatever means necessary. With a final, sputtering curse, Blackwood wheeled his horse around. "You will answer for this, both of you? The Lord's judgment, and the community's, will not be so easily dismissed." He galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats hanging in the hot, still air. The silence that descended was heavy, charged. The encounter had stripped away another layer of illusion, exposing the raw nerve of their precarious existence. That night, the fire seemed to offer little warmth. The unspoken hung between them, thicker than the smoke. It was Hester who broke the silence. She looked at Silas, his profile stark in the firelight, the tension still evident in the set of his jaw. He had stood for her, unequivocally. He deserved some measure of truth, however bitter. "That man, Flint," she began, her voice low, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "The one I was supposed to meet. He wouldn't have been the first white man to think he owned me, body and soul." Silas said nothing, just listened, his gaze steady on the fire. "I was in Missouri before," she continued, the words coming slowly, each one unearthed from a deep, painful place. "Married to a man, a white man. He owned a small plantation, had some standing." Her voice flattened. "He was not kind. He believed a wife, especially a colored wife, was property, to be used, and broken." The fire crackled, the only sound for a long moment. He took pleasure in the breaking. She paused, gathering herself. "I had to end that marriage myself. Silas, with these own hands." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but it was imbued with a chilling finality. He made my life a living hell. One night, he came at me, worse than usual. There was a struggle. The law, the white man's law, was never on the side of a black woman like me, not against a man like him. I had to find my own justice. It was him or me. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes, expecting to see revulsion, fear, condemnation. Silas was quiet for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He picked up a fallen branch and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, but devoid of judgment. A woman who's had to do what you did to survive. To fight her way out of a hell like that. He shook his head slowly. That don't scare me. Hester, it tells me about the steel in you. It tells me I can trust your strength, your will to live. He looked directly at her then, and in his eyes, she saw not fear, but a profound, almost startling understanding. You're the kind of person I'd stake my life on when a real storm hits. Hester, the kind you want beside you, not against you. His words, simple, direct, landed in the desolate landscape of her soul like a long-delayed rain. No judgment, no condemnation, only a stark acknowledgement of her fight and an unexpected declaration of trust, a warmth, unfamiliar and profound, spread through Hester Washington, a feeling she hadn't dared to hope for. The hardships remained. The prejudices of Redemption Creek still loomed, but here, by this meager fire, under the silent stars, a bond forged in shared adversity and unexpected acceptance had truly taken root. Two outcasts, from two different worlds, had found a common, if perilous, ground. The fragile warmth born of Silas's acceptance did little to thaw the hard realities of their existence, but it fueled a different kind of fire within Hester, a stubborn ember of defiance. The land remained an adversary, their lean-to a meager shield against the elements, yet the shared understanding between them became a silent bulwark. Weeks bled into months, each day a testament to their shared tenacity. The meager garden Hester had coaxed from the unwilling soil yielded a small harvest. Carefully stored, Silas's traps sometimes brought game, sometimes only frustration, but the need for essentials, salt to preserve what little meat they had, more seeds for a spring that felt a lifetime away, a few rounds for the aging shotgun, perhaps some quinine if it could be afforded. Grew pressing, the decision to go into Redemption Creek together was a grim necessity. They both knew the reception awaiting them. Hester, with Silas's quiet assistance, mended her one presentable dress, patching the worn fabric with scraps from her meager belongings. She scrubbed her skin raw with coarse sand and water from their dwindling supply, braided her graying hair tightly. When they set out, the early morning sun cast long shadows before them. They were leaner, their faces etched with the lines of hard labor and constant vigilance, but their eyes held a new resilience, a shared resolve that hadn't been there before. The jingle of the bell above the door of Henderson's General Mercantile was unnaturally loud in the sudden, suffocating silence that fell as they stepped inside. Every head turned, every conversation died. The store, moments before a hub of mundane commerce, became a gallery of hostile stares. Mrs. Henderson herself, a woman whose piety was as pronounced as her disdain for anyone who didn't fit her narrow worldview, stood near the counter, her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, fixed on Hester, not with mere curiosity, but with a revulsion usually reserved for something venomous or unclean. It was the same look she'd given Hester in the church, magnified by the intervening weeks of gossip and festering resentment. Hester's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her spine remained straight. Years of enduring scorn had taught her to build an fortress around her core. She met no one's gaze directly, yet her awareness of every hostile glance, every whispered aside just beyond hearing, was acute. She walked towards the counter, Silas a half step behind her, his presence a silent, unwavering support. "Half a pound of salt," Hester said, her voice surprisingly clear and steady, cutting through the oppressive quiet. "A can of beans, and 6 shotgun shells." Tom, the young man behind the counter, barely more than a boy, flushed a deep red. He avoided her eyes, his hands fumbling with the items, nearly dropping the small sack of salt. He was clearly terrified, caught between his employer's known prejudices and the unnerving presence of this black woman and her white husband. Silas stepped forward, his movement economical but definite. He placed a few worn coins, the fruit of their relentless labor, on the scarred wooden counter. His voice, when he spoke, was low, but it carried a distinct edge of warning. "You deaf? Tom, get my wife her goods." The young man jumped, nodding quickly, his Adam's apple bobbing. He snatched up the coins and practically threw the items into a rough sack. This time, there were no open snickers, no lewd comments like the ones that had followed Hester from the church, but the air crackled with unspoken animosity, a tension so thick it was almost palpable. It was the silence of a coiled snake, not of peace. As they turned to leave, Hester caught a glimpse of her reflection in a tarnished, fly-specked mirror hanging behind the counter. The face that stared back was a stranger, and yet intimately familiar. Gaunt, weathered, the lines of hardship etched deep around her eyes and mouth. The long, pale scar on her cheekbone, a memento from her dead husband, stood out starkly against her dark skin, a permanent brand. It was the face of a survivor, stark and unyielding. Once outside, the bright sunlight felt like a physical blow after the gloom of the store. They walked quickly, putting distance between themselves and the suffocating judgment of Redemption Creek. They'll never forget what happened at the church. "Silas," Hester said, her voice low, tinged with a bitterness that even her iron will couldn't entirely suppress, but also a weary strength. Silas reached out, his calloused fingers briefly, surprisingly gently, gripping her arm. His gaze was filled with a respect that warmed her more than the sun. "No, Hester, they won't, but they'll also have to remember damn clearly who walked out of there with their head held high, despite every last one of them." They were clear of the town before the sun reached its zenith. By the time dusk began to settle, painting the harsh landscape in shades of gray, a biting wind had picked up, carrying the first flurries of snow. Winter, the true, unforgiving Colorado winter, was upon them, back at their camp, while Hester meticulously patched the holes in their canvas lean-to against the encroaching cold. Silas worked with grim determination, digging deeper trenches around the goat pen, trying to provide some meager shelter for their few remaining animals. The ground was already hardening, promising a brutal season. But the fire within Hester, the one fueled by survival and a dawning, fierce loyalty, had only just begun to burn in earnest. By the third month of that relentless winter, their reserves had dwindled to almost nothing. A handful of moldy flour, a few stringy, dried squirrels Silas had snared weeks ago. The goats were skeletal, their milk long dried up. Silas's stubborn, aging ox, their only draft animal, had wandered off during a particularly vicious blizzard one night, taking their last good length of rope with it. Silas had found its tracks in the fresh snow the next morning, a faltering trail that ended abruptly in a spray of frozen blood and the drag marks of a heavy carcass. Wolves, most likely. He hadn't told Hester the grim details, only that the ox was gone. Hester, drawing on reserves of knowledge gleaned from a lifetime of scraping by, fought back against the encroaching starvation with a quiet, desperate ferocity. She scraped patches of thin, edible moss from the undersides of rocks, boiling it with bitter tree bark to create a thin, unappetizing but life-sustaining brew. She made broth from old bones, cracked open for their marrow, simmered for hours with melted snow. Silas watched her, his face a mask of worry and a profound, aching admiration. It was, he thought, like watching a lone general wage a silent, desperate war against an overwhelming enemy. "We'll make it through. Hester," he said one evening, his voice rough with guilt and a forced optimism he didn't feel. "I promise." Hester didn't reply, her attention fixed on stirring the bubbling pot over the meager fire, her silence a heavier weight than any words. The town's animosity, too, refused to be buried by the snow. One bitter night, the wind, howling like a banshee, threatening to rip their canvas shelter to shreds, Silas returned from checking his trap lines, his hands raw and bleeding. It wasn't the blood of any animal. Fresh, ugly gashes lay open across his knuckles. Hester said nothing, but her eyes narrowed. She tore strips from one of her old letters, the one from Josiah Flint, its paper now brittle and yellowed, and carefully, gently bandaged his torn flesh. "You were in a fight, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low, devoid of accusation, simply stating a fact. Silas flinched, tried to pull his hand away. "No, just a busted fence post. Slipped." His voice was weary, the lie thin and unconvincing. Hester knew. She didn't press. She understood that some battles were fought in the shadows, some lines crossed out of grim necessity, to protect what little they had, to secure even a mouthful of food. Later, in the deep, frigid dark of the lean-to, the fire a dying ember, they lay side by side, the cold a tangible presence. "I used to think," Hester said suddenly, her voice a low murmur, almost lost in the wind's mournful cry, "that marriage was a kind of prison, a soft one, maybe, the kind that rots you slow from the inside. With you, Silas, it's hard labor, a constant fight just to draw breath, but it's the kind of work, the kind of fight I can live with." She shifted, turning her head towards him in the darkness. "You think they'll come for us? The townsfolk, Reverend Blackwood, that Henderson woman, someone." Silas was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, a barely perceptible movement. "Sure, Hester," he said, his voice strangely calm. "They'll never forget a woman, especially a colored woman, who shamed 'em in front of their own, not in a place like Redemption Creek, all puffed up with its own righteousness. Let 'em come." And come they did. Not with torches and pitchforks. Not yet. It began insidiously. Malicious rumors, spreading like prairie fire. At Henderson's store, the price of goods inexplicably doubled, then tripled, but only for them. The small, clear stream where they drew their drinking water was found fouled one morning, choked with pig guts and offal dumped upstream. The old, drunken ranch hand who'd mumbled a blessing at their impromptu wedding beneath the cottonwood vanished without a trace. His dilapidated shack burned to the ground, leaving only a blackened patch of earth. Then, one Sunday morning, as a pale sun struggled to break through the winter clouds, Hester found it a crude wooden cross, deeply, angrily carved into the trunk of the largest cottonwood near their lean-to. The gashes were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds like tears of blood. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her face unreadable, and went inside to build the morning fire. Her movements precise, deliberate. Silas saw it later, and his face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "They're warning us." "Hester," he bit out, his voice a low growl. Hester looked at him, her eyes like chips of obsidian, cold and hard. "No, Silas," she said, her voice steady, resonant with a defiant strength. "They ain't just warning us. They're testing our endurance, our patience." They stayed. The winter dragged on. Its icy claws sunk deep into the land. They took turns standing watch through the long, frozen nights. They moved their trap lines closer to a narrow, defensible canyon, where boulders offered some cover from prying eyes. In that crucible of silence and shared peril, something shifted subtly between them. He started calling her Hetty, the diminutive falling from his lips with an unaccustomed tenderness. She found herself saving him the hottest, strongest portion of their dwindling coffee supply each morning, even when there was barely enough for one. They rarely touched, but when they did, his calloused hand brushing hers as he passed her the skinning knife, her head resting for a fleeting moment against his shoulder as they sat watching the wind whip across the desolate, snow-covered hills. Those brief contacts resonated with an unspoken depth, a bond forged in hardship, as solid and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath their feet. February arrived, a month of iron-gray skies and biting winds, the snow still falling in sporadic, listless flurries. It was on one such afternoon that Reverend Blackwood returned. He wasn't alone. With him were two men. One, Hester recognized with a chill, was Mrs. Henderson's son, his face harder, meaner than she remembered, carrying an air of sullen aggression. The other was a stranger, lean and weathered, a Colt peacemaker tied low on his hip, his eyes cold and watchful, the unmistakable look of a man who dealt in violence for a living. Silas met them halfway up the slight incline to their camp, positioning himself between them and the lean-to. Hester watched from the opening, the loaded shotgun cold in her hands, its familiar weight a grim comfort. "We've had enough of your arrogance and stubbornness, McBride," Blackwood announced, his voice dripping with smug condescension. He sat high on his horse, a dark, avenging angel. "This is our land." "Reverend," Silas stated, his voice calm, unyielding. Blackwood spat onto the frozen ground. "You've made it so, but it was never yours." And that woman, his eyes, sharp and malevolent, flicked past Silas towards the lean-to. "She belongs nowhere on this earth." The armed stranger urged his horse forward a step, his gaze unwavering. "She's got a warrant on her head," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, chillingly certain. "From Missouri, for murdering her husband." Silas didn't react, his expression unreadable, but there was no surprise in his eyes. Hester stepped out from the lean-to, her worn shawl pulled tight around her, the shotgun held loosely at her side. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat, severe bun. Her eyes, fixed on the stranger's, held no fear, no apology. "Yes," she said, her voice even carrying the weight of her past and the defiance of her present. "He was my husband. He tried to hang me with my own apron string. I had to stop him. Any way I could." The bounty hunter, for that's what he surely was, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Law says you fled, means you're guilty. I say I survived," Hester countered, her voice ringing with a dignity that shamed his cynicism. "That's the truth. The only truth." Reverend Blackwood raised his Bible aloft, like a weapon. "You bring sin here," he thundered, his face contorted with fanaticism. "You defile this sacred land with your crimes. We've come to take you back to face justice." Silas stepped forward again, placing himself squarely in front of Hester, a human shield against their accusers. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet, cold as the wind whistling through the canyon. "No, you've come because she reminds you a woman can survive and stand tall without your false mercies, without your petty rules, and that scares the living hell out of every last one of you." The bounty hunter's hand drifted towards the butt of his Colt. "You harborin' a wanted fugitive, McBride." "She's my wife," Silas declared, the words a vow, an unbreakable promise. "She ain't runnin' from nothin'. She's livin' a life she earned, a life she deserves. Got the marriage certificate right here, in my pocket. Says different from what your kind of law thinks." He met the bounty hunter's gaze, unwavering. "So," Silas said, his voice dropping to an almost gentle, yet utterly lethal softness, "come and take her, if you got the nerve." Hester didn't move, didn't flinch. The twin muzzles of the shotgun remained pointed downwards, not directly at any one man, but near enough to their booted feet to underscore her readiness. The wind moaned, carrying the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. The silence stretched, taut and breathless, a razor's edge between life and death. Reverend Blackwood's face had gone pale, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He took a hesitant step back. "Let them rot out here, then," he hissed, his voice cracking with impotent fury and a fear he couldn't quite conceal. He wheeled his horse, Henderson's son and the bounty hunter following suit, their retreat hasty, almost a rout. The sound of their horses' hooves striking the frozen ground echoed like shattering glass in the sudden, vast emptiness. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The echo of hooves, fading into the frozen landscape, left behind a silence more profound, more menacing than any sound. The threat hadn't been neutralized, merely postponed. That night, the small fire in their lean-to felt insufficient against the chill that seeped not just from the earth, but from the marrow of their bones. Silas stared into the flames, the orange light dancing in his grim eyes. "You'll need to leave, Hetty," he said, his voice low, heavy with a concern that was a raw wound. "If they come back, and they will, likely with more men, I can't have you here. I won't." He wouldn't call it running. He'd call it her surviving, a tactical retreat he'd cover. Hester looked up from mending a tear in his worn buckskin shirt, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Her face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was a study in resolute defiance. "No, Silas." Her voice was quiet but unshakable. "This is my land now, same as yours. I've watered it with my sweat, bled on it. I'm not going anywhere." The thought of running again, of ceding one more patch of earth to hatred, was a bitterness she could no longer swallow. He met her gaze, a long, searching look that held a mixture of admiration and a deep, troubling understanding. You've taken a man's life before, Hetty. Could you do it again, if it came to that?" The question was stark, stripped of any judgment, a brutal necessity. Hester's eyes didn't waver. She looked directly into his, her own gaze as steady and clear as a deep, still pool. "I can kill for something, Silas, or for someone I cherish and aim to protect. That's a world away from killin' out of malice or for some dark gain." Her past was a shadow, but it had also been a forge, shaping her into something unbreakable. He nodded slowly, a profound respect dawning in his eyes. He turned back to the fire, the silence stretching, filled only by the crackle of burning wood and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble of grim determination. "All right then, we'll wait, together." And wait, they did. The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a chasm of uncertainty. The ice on the creek began to groan and crack, yielding to the relentless, subtle pressure of a reluctant spring. Tiny, tentative green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. The silence of the mountains was profound, yet it thrummed with an unspoken tension. A fragile peace stretched taut as a poorly tanned hide, threatening to snap at any moment. They lived on a knife's edge, taking turns on watch, day and night. The Winchester and the shotgun always loaded, always within reach. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by the slightest unfamiliar sound. Words were scarce between them during those taut days, but their bond deepened, an unspoken language of shared vigilance and quiet care. Hester still saved him the hottest, strongest portion of their meager coffee each morning, a small ritual that spoke volumes in the frigid dawn. Silas, in turn, would ensure she had the choicest cut of any game he managed to bring down. Or he'd spend hours meticulously patching the wind-torn canvas of the lean-to, ensuring she was shielded from the biting night air. Their touches were infrequent, born of necessity, his calloused hand brushing hers as he passed her the skinning knife, her head resting for a fleeting, exhausted moment against his solid shoulder as they sat together, watching the wind scour the distant, barren hills. Yet these brief, almost accidental contacts resonated with an extraordinary power, a deep, grounding warmth that anchored them both against the storm they knew was gathering. The storm broke on a day that had dawned with a deceptive calm. Silas was outside, expanding the small root cellar he'd dug into the hillside, the rich, dark earth still clinging to his hands, his shovel mid-swing. Hester was by the fire pit, preparing their scant midday meal. Then they heard it. Hoofbeats, not the hesitant, scattered approach of a few riders, but a drumming, relentless thunder that vibrated through the ground itself. 10, maybe 12 riders, Silas gauged, moving fast, with a grim, unified purpose. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution. Inside, Silas roared. The single word, a lash of command. Hester didn't question, didn't hesitate. By the time they'd scrambled into the lean-to, Silas slamming the crude wooden door shut and dropping the heavy bar into place. She had the shotgun in her hands, its cold steel a familiar weight. Silas grabbed his Winchester from its hooks beneath a canvas flap, his movement swift and practiced as he checked the chamber, then slung the rifle over his shoulder. No words were exchanged. None were needed. This moment, they both knew, had been seeded long ago, nurtured in silence and anticipation. Now, it was blooming in a terrifying cacophony of approaching hooves. The riders didn't dismount. They fanned out, forming a menacing semicircle along the ridge overlooking the small homestead. Just outside the flimsy pole fence Silas had painstakingly erected, Reverend Gideon Blackwood was at their center, his dark preacher's coat flapping in the winds. The Bible was gone. In its place, a heavy dragoon revolver was holstered conspicuously at his hip. To his right sat the bounty hunter, his face an unreadable mask of cold professionalism. To Blackwood's left was Henderson's son, his youthful features hardened into a sneer of malice, a fresh, livid scar tracing a jagged line down his cheek. He cradled a rifle across his lap, his finger already on the trigger. Silas stepped out first, his Winchester held loosely, muzzle intentionally pointed towards the ground. Hester was a shadow at his back, emerging into the pale sunlight. No shawl today, just her worn work dress, and in her eyes, the terrifying calm of a woman who had faced death before and had no intention of backing down now. "You've been warned." Blackwood's voice boomed across the small clearing, laced with fanaticism and a chilling self-righteousness. "This is your last chance to surrender and face judgment." Silas nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've said that many times, Reverend. Now we bring final judgment," Blackwood cried, his voice rising. "Your last chance to repent." Hester stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Silas, facing the armed mob squarely. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly clear, carrying a note of pure, unadulterated contempt that cut through Blackwood's sanctimony. "If this is truly God's judgment, Reverend, then he wouldn't need to send 10 heavily armed men to deliver it. He could send himself." A ripple of unease went through the posse. One man spat on the ground. Henderson's son nervously shifted his rifle. The bounty hunter urged his horse forward slightly. "We have legal papers," he stated, his voice flat and cold. "She's wanted. She's coming with us, dead or alive." "No," Silas said, his voice quiet but absolute. If you take her, it'll be her body you drag out, and that means you'll die before you lay a hand on her." The bounty hunter's lips curled into a cruel sneer. "Then you'll die with her. You damn fool." Hester raised the shotgun, then, the twin muzzles gaping like dark eyes at the assembled men. "I've buried one miserable, godless man who thought he owned me," she declared, her voice ringing with a chilling conviction. "I still have room in the earth for a few more of his kind." That's when the first shot cracked the air. But it didn't come from the posse. It came from behind them. A high-powered Winchester roared from the direction of the narrow canyon bordering their claim. Chaos erupted. One of the rearmost riders cried out, his horse screaming as it bucked and fell, throwing him head-first to the rocky ground. A second shot followed almost immediately, plucking the hat from another man's head, the bullet whining past his ear with a sound like an angry hornet. "Sniper!" Someone shrieked. "Ambush!" Silas reacted instantly, dropping to one knee, the Winchester already at his shoulder. He fired, a precise, calculated shot. Another rider in the disorganized pack cried out and clutched his arm. Tumbling from his saddle, Hester stood her ground, a figure of astonishing, terrible stillness. She leveled the shotgun and fired a single, devastating blast. The horse of her chosen target shrieked in agony as buckshot tore into its flank, rearing violently and trampling its rider under its flailing hooves. The posse dissolved into a panicked mob. Men shouted, horses screamed, guns fired wildly in all directions. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the raw stench of fear. Several riders, their courage utterly broken, wheeled their horses and fled, galloping madly back towards the dubious safety of Redemption Creek. In moments, it was over. Only Reverend Blackwood remained, seemingly frozen in his saddle, his drawn revolver hanging uselessly in his trembling hand. Silas rose slowly, walking towards him, the Winchester still ready. "You came to kill, Reverend," Silas said, his voice laced with a weary contempt. "But you didn't bring the stomach for it, did you?" Blackwood swallowed hard, his face ashen. That woman," he stammered, his bravado shattered. "She's not your burden, McBride." "No," Silas affirmed, his voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "She's not a burden. She's my choice, my life." Blackwood tried to raise his pistol, but his hand shook too violently. Hester walked to stand beside Silas, the shotgun still aimed squarely at the preacher. He looked into her eyes, unwavering, unafraid, and saw not hatred, not vengeance, but a profound, unyielding resolve, a terrible certainty that rendered any further words, any pleas or threats, utterly meaningless. He let the revolver fall from his nerveless fingers to the ground. Then, with a broken sob, he turned his horse and rode away, a defeated man, his boots drumming a hollow retreat on the hard earth. As the dust settled, a figure slowly emerged from the rocks at the edge of the canyon. A girl, no more than 16, stepped into view, a Winchester rifle held expertly in her hands. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, her clothes ragged and stained with the dust of the trail. She said nothing, simply watched them with wide, wary eyes. Hester nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. "You fired the first shot." The girl nodded, her gaze flicking towards the fallen men on the hillside, then back to Hester. "Why?" Hester asked. The girl's voice, when she spoke, was low and strangely distant. "I saw how they rode in, all righteous and full of hate. I saw your face, ma'am, when you stood up to 'em. I figured you were like me, someone who had enough." Silas lowered his rifle slowly. "What's your name?" "Girl. Abigail," she replied. "Most folks call me Abby." Hester stepped forward, her movements gentle, and reached for the rifle. Abby relinquished it without hesitation. "Come inside and eat something." "Abby," Hester said, a surprising warmth in her voice, an immediate, instinctive understanding passing between them. "You must be starved." Abigail Jessup looked from Hester to Silas, then nodded once, and followed them into the bullet-scarred lean-to, leaving the carnage and the questions for another time. The acrid tang of gunpowder still hung heavy in the air, a grim perfume mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth. The silence that descended after the posse's chaotic retreat was broken only by the ragged breathing of the living and the soft moans of a wounded horse. Night fell swift and cold, swallowing the blood-soaked ground. Hester, Silas, and the girl, Abby, moved like ghosts in the deepening gloom, dragging the bodies of the fallen attackers to a shallow ravine west of the lean-to. There were no prayers said, no eulogies offered, only the grim, rhythmic thud of earth and rock piled atop the dead. The wind, whistling through the canyon, sang their only requiem. Later, huddled by the meager fire inside the lean-to, Abby ate a piece of dried squirrel meat with a ravenous hunger, though her hands still trembled. The firelight cast stark shadows on her young, dirt-streaked face, a face that had seen too much, too soon. "Where you from, Abby?" Silas asked, his voice gentler than Hester had ever heard it. The girl flinched, her eyes darting towards the darkness beyond the firelight. "A farm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Up north, near a place called Broad Hollow. With my uncle." She trailed off, her gaze falling to the floor, a curtain dropping over a story she wasn't ready to tell. Hester watched her, a familiar ache resonating deep within her own scarred past. She didn't press. "You can stay here, Abby," she said, her voice calm, steady, an anchor in the storm-tossed silence. "Long as you like." Abby's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a fragile, dawning hope. Even if I got blood on my hands." The words were a bare whisper, heavy with a burden no child should carry. Hester met the girl's haunted gaze, her own expression unyielding, yet imbued with a profound, sorrowful understanding. "We all got blood on our hands here, child," she said, the truth of it as raw and unsparing as the land itself. "None of us are clean. It ain't about what's in your past, Abby, but what you choose to do with it next. Which road you take from here on out." Abby didn't reply, but the tension in her small shoulders seemed to ease almost imperceptibly. She didn't run, she stayed. The weeks that followed were a blur of labor and a slow, cautious healing. The canyon, as if sensing a shift in the violent energies that had plagued it, began to unfurl its spring finery. Silas's 2 remaining goats, survivors of the harsh winter, bore twin kids, their bleating a fragile note of new life. The traps, now set with Abby's surprisingly skillful assistance, yielded a steady supply of small game. Gentle rains fell, softening the hard earth, coaxing forth a carpet of tender green. Together, Hester and Silas, with Abby a silent, diligent shadow, began to build a second, sturdier cabin next to the lean-to. Hester wielded a bucksaw with an practiced competence that surprised Silas, her movements economical and strong. Abby, quick to learn, proved herself invaluable, her small hands deft, her spirit resilient. Redemption Creek, or Dry Gulch as some called it, remained a silent, brooding presence to the north. No one came, not to retrieve their dead, not to offer condolences or threats. No preacher dared venture into the canyon to pronounce judgment or offer absolution. The fear was a palpable thing, a wall thicker than any stone. One morning, as Silas was reinforcing the fence line, Abby approached him, a tattered, weather-beaten piece of paper clutched in her hand. She'd found it nailed to a tree half a mile down the canyon, a wanted poster. Hester took it from her, The crude charcoal sketch was a ghost of a face she barely recognized as her own. The lines harsh, the eyes haunted. Hester Kane, also known as Hester Vance, for the murder of... She didn't need to read the rest. Without a word, she turned and tossed the poster into the flames of the cook fire. Silas came to stand beside her, watching the paper curl, blacken, and dissolve into ash. Was that your ghost, Hetty?" he asked, his voice low, thoughtful. Hester stared into the fire, a strange calmness settling over her. "Used to be, Silas," she said, her voice devoid of inflection, yet carrying a profound sense of release. "But that ghost is dead now, died with its past." They stood together, watching the last fragile embers of the poster drift upwards, carried away by the breeze, over a land that no longer answered to the laws of Dry Gulch or the vengeful god of men like Blackwood. A land now wholly their own, a testament to the unyielding will of its survivors. Spring deepened, a slow, hesitant apology from the earth for the brutality of winter. The stream, swollen with snowmelt, gurgled and sang. Migratory birds returned, their songs echoing through the canyon. Hester, sleeves rolled to her elbows, worked the newly turned earth with a rusty spade, planting the precious seeds. Onion sets, seed potatoes, coarse beans wrapped in waxed cloth. She'd bartered from a traveling Basque shepherd. Silas repaired the roof of the new cabin. Abby sat by the fire, meticulously fletching arrows. No one spoke of the men buried in the ravine. The earth kept its silence, and they, in turn, had learned to live within that silence. In early May, another stranger rode into the canyon. He was alone, gaunt, his clothes worn thin by weather and miles. No badge, no Bible, just a wide-brimmed black hat and a dusty, white beard that flowed over his chest. His mare was lame in the foreleg. Hester saw him coming, her senses honed to a razor's edge. Silas emerged from the cabin, his hand resting on the Winchester, but he didn't raise it. The stranger lifted an open palm, a universal sign of peace. "Then, don't bring any trouble," Silas called out, his voice still wary. "Lookin' for someone?" The stranger rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Name of Hester Kane, or maybe Hester Vance." Abby materialized beside Hester, silent as always, the bow she now carried constantly, a natural extension of her spine. Hester straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "You found her?" The stranger nodded, removing his hat. "Name's Elijah Starr. I knew your brother." Hester's face remained impassive. "I don't have a brother." He dismounted slowly, favoring his own stiff leg. He said, different. "Said your name was Hester Kane, born in Clover Hollow. Said you left home at 15 after a man. Shamed you. Said he searched for you for years. Never found you. Died with your name on his lips." Hester's breath caught in her throat, a rusty hinge groaning. Silas moved closer, a silent presence at her side. He left something. Elijah Starr continued, "Asked me to get it to you. If I ever heard word." From a worn leather pouch on his saddle, he produced a small, oiled skin bag. Hester made no move to take it. "Why now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Took years to track the name to any place certain. Then I heard the whispers. Down in Dry Gulch. Whole town scared to even speak your name. Ma'am, like it's a curse." Abby allowed herself a thin, knowing smirk. "It is. For some." Elijah Starr managed a tired smile. "Ain't here to stir old ashes. Just deliver a ghost." He placed the small bag at Hester's feet. Then, without waiting for thanks, remounted and rode away, the lame mare disappearing into the shadows of the canyon. Inside the bag was a crudely fashioned iron cross, a faded blue ribbon, and a single, folded letter. Hester read it later, alone, under the vast, silent canopy of the old cottonwood tree where she had first signed her name beside Silas's, a lifetime ago. The ink was blurred, the handwriting that of a man constantly on the move. "I looked for you. Hester." It read, "Swear to God, I did. If this ever finds you, I hope the world ain't broke your back. Always remembered you. Little sister, a wild, strong bird. Hope you kept that wildness." She folded the letter, pressed it to her chest, and sat there for a long, long time, the silence of the canyon enveloping her. When she finally rose, her face was unchanged, but something in her eyes had shifted, softened, like hard ground after a long-awaited rain. That night, she burned the letter in the campfire, not in anger or shame, but as a final, peaceful letting go. Weeks turned into months. They built a third cabin, even sturdier than the second. Abby, unasked, slept in it one night, then dragged her blanket back to her familiar spot by the hearth in Hester and Silas's cabin, offering no explanation. Hester made no comment. Some survivors, she knew, thrived best within the breathing space of others. In June, traders from the south arrived, 3 wagons laden with goods. They were friendly, offering peaches preserved in sugar, white flour, and bolts of brightly colored thread. Silas traded furs. Hester, in a rare moment of indulgence, bought a length of green calico fabric. Abby caught her stroking it later, under the moonlight, her fingers tracing the floral pattern as if recalling a beautiful dream that had never quite come to pass. Dry Gulch remained a fearful silence to the north. Reverend Blackwood, it was rumored, had vanished. The Henderson family, too. Their arrogance had dissolved in the face of a terror they couldn't comprehend. The names Cain and Hester were spoken only in hushed, frightened whispers, if at all. Yet the land remembered. One day, checking her snares, Abby found 2 children cowering near the ravine. They were gaunt, shoeless, their faces cracked and raw. She brought them back to the cabins without a word. They didn't speak for 3 days, only ate and slept and watched with wide, hunted eyes. Then the older one, a girl, whispered that their pa had gone west for silver and never returned, and their ma had died in the spring rains. Hester asked no more questions. She showed them how to wash with sand from the creek. She gave them new names when they refused to speak their old ones, Ash and Thorn. Silas built more bunks. Abby gave the girl her spare knife. The place grew, not like a town, but like a wound slowly healing. The new skin rough, scarred, but undeniably strong. Others found their way there, 1 or 2 at a time, always quietly, always in need. A woman with a hair lip and a child who never cried. A man whose arms were a mass of puckered burn scars. A youth with the dark, fading imprint of fingers still visible on his throat. No one asked about the past. They were given space, food when it was plentiful, work if they were able. "We'll run out of room soon, Silas," Hester said one evening, a rare note of worry in her voice. He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Not sooner than we run out of compassion." Hetty, by midsummer, 11 souls called the canyon home. There was no formal law, no church, no named graves, just a place where no one mocked you for the desperate, messy business of survival. And beyond the cabins, beyond the smoke of the cook fires, the land watched, waited, as the summer monsoons swept through. The canyon transformed, the rains uncovered secrets. New water channels carved through stone, old bones bleached white, rusted iron tools, the rotten timbers of forgotten structures. Here, nothing stayed buried forever. The main cabin now had 2 rooms. Abby, with an artist's touch, carved a lintel for the door from a cottonwood branch, etching into it a triangle, point down, a symbol of shelter, of quiet defiance. Each newcomer, Hester noticed, paused at that carving, a hand briefly touching the wood before they entered. Silas built a smokehouse. Hester oversaw the digging of a proper well. The children, Ash and Thorn, now slept soundly through the fiercest thunderstorms. Abby began to teach the others how to shoot straight, how to move like shadows among the rocks, how to bring down a man twice your size. It wasn't an army, not yet, but it was something, and still they came, broken men, hunted women, fugitives from a world that had no place for them. They came not with hope, but with a raw, visceral need to simply live. Hester never turned anyone away. One day, a writer from Dry Gulch brought news. The town had a new preacher, young, zealous, with shiny gold buttons and polished boots. He spoke of restoring order and morality, of cleansing the valley, and he declared that the woman known as Hester Kane, or Vance, or whatever cursed name the devil had given her, would be brought to trial before the year was out. Silas heard the news without flinching. Hester merely said, "He'll come," and when he did, it was not with a gun, but with ink and paper. In late August, a letter was found pinned to the rough-hewn gate of their settlement with a skinning knife. Silas brought it to Hester. "He wants a meeting." "Hetty," Silas said, his voice calm. "He'll come alone. Says, if we won't answer to God, we'll answer to man." Aye. Hester dried her hands on her apron, took the letter, read it. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "All right," she said. They met him under the ancient cottonwood tree, the young preacher, a Reverend Silas Pike. The irony of the name, so like Blackwood's former enforcer, was not lost on Hester. Wore a clean linen suit. He carried no weapon, only a book in one hand and a silver cross around his neck. "I am here, as promised," he announced, as if it were an act of immense bravery. Hester sat on a felled log. Silas stood behind her. Abby, a silent sentinel, was off to one side, her bow resting across her lap. "You've built a heresy here," Pike declared, his gaze sweeping over their small, burgeoning community with undisguised disapproval. A den of renegades, criminals, blasphemers. Hester watched a crow preen on a branch above. "We've built a place where no one starves or freezes. Reverend, you protect murderers. I protect those who survived being murdered. You deny the laws of God and of man." "No, Reverend," Hester said, her voice even. "We just remember what the law too often forgets, that men in collars and uniforms ain't always the same as justice or truth." Pike opened his book. "You will be judged," he proclaimed, "not by me, but by history, by what you have created." Hester rose. She bent, picked up a small, smooth stone, and held it out to him. "Then tell history this, Reverend," she said, her voice low, resonant with an unshakable authority. "You tried to break a woman, and you failed. You tried to shame her, and she built a kingdom from the ashes." She pressed the stone into his hand. "Throw it, Reverend. Isn't that what men like you do best? Cast stones at what you don't understand, won't accept, and deeply fear." He stared at the stone, then at her, his youthful certainty wavering. He didn't throw it. He turned and walked back down the trail, alone. They never saw him again. By late September, the canyon had a name, whispered among the dispossessed Kane's refuge. Hester carved it herself on the gate. One crisp autumn morning, Hester Kane, A.S.T., 1878. Silas added his name beneath hers. Abby hung a newly fletched arrow above the carving. The children grew. Ash became a skilled trapper. Thorn learned to lie with a conviction that could sway stone, always in defense of their sanctuary. They sometimes called Hester Mama Lo, a name cobbled together from an old, half-forgotten surname whispered in Abby's past. a term of endearment spoken when they thought she wasn't listening. She always heard. She never corrected them. One night, the three of them, Hester, Silas, and Abby, now a young woman of fierce, quiet strength, sat by the fire. The others slept. "You ever think of leaving this place?" "Hetty," Silas asked, his voice thoughtful. Hester looked into the flames, her reflection staring back, hard, resolute. "This place," she said, "is the first thing in my life I built with my own hands. Silas, nobody's taken it from me. Ever." Abby nodded, her eyes glittering in the firelight. "We'd burn it all down before we let anyone try." Hester smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the harsh lines of her face. "We'll never have to," she said, and she was right. No lawman, no posses, no righteous preachers ever again dared to cross the boundaries of Cain's refuge. It remained a shadow on the hills, a testament to resilience, a haven for the lost, forever watched over by a woman who had refused to be broken.